In the beginning there was nothing. And then, after a long time, we had Earth but without people. In fact, it took a long time before anything living and breathing appeared. And you might ask yourself, where did people and all the other life on our planet come from? Who was the first living creature? And how is it possible that so many different descendants came from the same ancestors? And today, we will try to solve the riddle of the existence and evolution of life on Earth. First, we must say that the question of how life on Earth is not an exact science. Most scientists use what is called the fossil record to see when certain events took place, to see when certain events happened. But the problem is that there are still many missing pieces. Scientists can see certain events, but there are long periods when nothing seems to have happened, or rather, they just haven't found anything that could fill in the gaps. Experts can also use what is called a molecular clock. Simply put, scientists look at the history rooted in the DNA of living organisms. By doing so, they can compare how similar or different species are at the molecular level, to try to find out when species diverged or separated from each other. It is generally believed that life on Earth originated about 3,800,000,000 years ago. But as we have already said, this is just an approximate figure, a reasonable assumption. The first life could have developed in the so-called alkaline hydrothermal springs underwater. Scientists speculate that these vents were the perfect environment for the production of something called either nucleic acid or RNA, one of the three basic macromolecules. The other two are DNA and proteins, which are stored in the cells of all living things and play an important role in the coding, reading, regulation, and expression of genes. The theory is that these hydrothermal fluids rose through a hole in the ground into the primary seawater. In short, this reaction ended up forming simple, organic molecules, and a bunch of reactions led to the formation of amino acids. Bubbles in the water filled with these molecules began to self-replicate. This led to the formation of the first cells or protocells. Then the production of bacteria and archaea began, which scientists will tell you is similar to the roots of the tree of life. There are other theories. For example, that life appeared because of a meteorite from Mars, or all the previously described reactions were caused by electrical storms. No one knows for sure. But what we do know is that single-celled organisms eventually came into existence. The life that was emerging did not look like a finished product at all. Humans, turtles, and starfish had to evolve from single-celled organisms. The oldest of them, according to the fossil record, lived about 3.5 billion years ago. And that's all there was for a long time. In fact, for about 1 billion years, single cells did nothing but simply existed. Then about 2.5 billion years ago, something special happened, what scientists call the Great Oxidation Event. When more oxygen began to appear on the Earth, more oxygen was available, thanks to the fact that bacteria learned photosynthesis and began to produce it. Then, 2,300,000,000 years ago, it became very cold on Earth, perhaps because there was little volcanic activity. This is probably also due to the fact that high concentrations of oxygen caused oxidation of methane in the atmosphere to form carbon dioxide. This led to what is now known as the Earth's first ice age, but the Earth did not remain a giant ice ball for long. When the ice melted, it created even more and more oxygen was created. Evidence was also found of a major event that happened about 2 billion years ago, when one cell fused with another. Together, they got along and multiplied to form something called eukaryotic cells. From that point on, things really started to go faster, because they soon led to the formation of the first green plants and green algae. But that was about 900 million years ago, when an even bigger event happened. the formation of true multicellular life, and eventually creatures known as plastic. These are tiny three-celled organisms, only about 1 millimeter in diameter. You have to remember that these creatures were not exactly complex. Humans have over 37 trillion cells, while the mighty placebo has only 3. It took us some time to get to the point where three-cellular organisms were floating in the Earth's oceans, and that's with many things left out. In short, the Earth turned into a giant snowball again. It thawed, and more complex organisms that lived in the water, some of which were the ancestors of modern jellyfish. Then, about 630 million years ago, something big happened again. Living beings with bilateral symmetry appeared. Animals. They have a certain upper and lower part. Before that, everything looked basically like a piece of floating jelly. The first of these new fascinating and more aesthetically pleasing creatures was probably Vernon Immaculata Guijuana. And from that moment on, animal life began to divide into races. This began to happen when the aforementioned worm evolved, or rather split into 2 different forms, which we call protostomes and deuterostomes. The former became arthropods, i.e., creatures with exoskeletons, such as insects and spiders. The latter will become vertebrates, such as mammals, birds, and fish. About 550 million years ago, the ocean was full of these more complex animals. We know from fossils that these waters used to be home to starfish, jellyfish, and actinia. But soon some creatures began to grow a bony spine. One of the first vertebrates we found was something that resembled a tadpole. It took only a few million years for evolution to move much further. About 540 million years ago, something important happened again that scientists learned about by looking at fossils and observing signs of an explosion of life forms. They call it Cambrian explosion. The phenomenon resulted in a sharp increase in the number of fossil remains of living things in the sediments. At the same time, no one knows why so many complex living organisms suddenly appeared. At this time, creatures began to appear very similar to the small animals we see today. Some of the earliest vertebrates looked a bit like modern eels, and one of the most famous photos of a fossil is of something that looks like a giant woodlice, which is actually an arthropod called a trilobite. But we're going to have to fast forward again to about 490 million years ago. There was a great Ordovician event, biodiversification, which means that there was more diversity in groups of animals and plants. A few more million years passed, and the fish in the sea began to divide into 2 groups, bony and so-called cartilaginous fish, which one day evolved into a shark. Then, about 400 million years ago, another extremely important event happened, when something called bivalves appeared. These creatures had lungs that allowed them to breathe outside the water, unlike other fish. If the water source disappeared, they could survive. This was a huge evolutionary advantage. 397 million years ago, the first four-legged animal. It was a significant event, because these four-legged creatures eventually took over the Earth. All mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles would descend from them. But building is never easy, and there are always periods of failure. About 250 million years ago, there was a mass extinction. Some survived, and after that the dinosaurs took over. Over the next 100 million years, we had many dinosaurs that evolved into mammals. The first true birds then came in the Neotropical period, and about 100 million years ago, mammals split into many different groups. They became everything: primates, rodents, elephants, armadillos, and bats. In general, there was an explosion and a split. All this time, dinosaurs roamed the Earth. Many millions of years later, plants began to grow actively. But about 5 million years after everything started to turn green, there was another mass extinction, and it's called the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, when not only dinosaurs, but also other reptiles, disappeared from the face of the earth, as well as mollusks and some algae. Then comes the era of primates. They split into two groups, and one of these groups would become the apes, and then us. Then about 55 million years ago, the earth heats up, and we have another extinction event. A huge number die, but the majority survive. Millions of years later, primates appear, such as gibbons, orangutans and gorillas. About 6 million years ago, human relatives branched off from chimpanzees and bonobos. About 2.5 million years ago, the genus Homo appeared. The genus Homo looked like ape people, but then they straightened up, and we began to call them Homo erectus. Later, more intelligent Neanderthals appeared, who hunted and gathered food. After that, the rise of Homo sapiens took place. About 50,000 years ago, there was a big leap forward, at which time people began to paint on cave walls and wear jewelry. They started thinking about the future, planning. This led to agriculture, society, language, art, politics, and eventually to you watching this video right now. Why did molecules react and form a cell? Why did things come together and why did things diverge? The reason may be simple. It just happened. In the beginning there was reaction. It led to another reaction. And that's why we exist. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel and like it. And see you soon.